Hi, I'm Jennifer Voltos.
And I'm Michael Carlin, and we're with the Center for Compassion, Integrity, and Secular Ethics at Life University. And this presentation will help you understand how to click through and present Skill 9, Appreciating Interdependence. That's part of Compassionate Integrity Training, and this is part of our facilitator training program. So as always, we start with this first slide that indicates that we're on Appreciating Interdependence and that we are now in Series 3, which is Engaging in Systems. We click the next slide and we get the build, as always. And again, this might be a good opportunity to talk about why we might move into a discussion on systems at this point and how this kind of leads to that. We talked about it in our last session about how compassion is a motivation, and this is an opportunity to start thinking about what we're going to do with that compassion. But it's a good opportunity to have that conversation and just see where people are at, and if they kind of remember that and begin to dive into that a little bit. When you click again, it shows what we're going to be focusing on today, and this is a good opportunity to check in with people about how their practice has been going. And with that, we move into the next slide, which I'm going to let Jennifer talk about. And just as a note, if you click once, the bird comes up, the owl comes up, and the word compassion, as well as discernment, and then that automatically fades into this idea of wisdom. So you only have to click once for that. So Jennifer,
Thank you, Michael.
Turn to you.
So this is a really important discussion as to why do we need to understand systems. And as we talked about in session 8, we have compassion and we have wisdom or discernment, the two wings of the bird. We can't fly. The bird can't fly without both of them. And so this is a great time to help to be able to understand the reason that we need both of these things. We need compassion and we need wisdom so that we can act with discernment and understand what these systems are all about that we're going to talk through. So if you click again, one of the bullet points will come up as compassion is a motivation. We click again, and compassion doesn't tell us what to do. We click the third time, compassion can actually lead to harm. And then if we click the fourth time, compassion can benefit one group and can harm another. And so when we're talking about systems, engaging in systems is really learning how to engage with discernment. And so we need to recognize that things that may harm us on an individual level can potentially harm society as well when they're perceived as the norm. And this also allows us to see an opportunity for change, beginning with ourselves. So we recognize harm to ourselves, we can make the determination that we want to change those mental attitudes that within ourselves, and then we can move on to helping others. That's acting with discernment. But in order to be able to do that, we need to click to the next slide, and we need to talk about interdependence. And so when we click on that slide, interdependence comes up with a great visual representation. So we want to have a conversation about what interdependence is. And so once we've had that conversation, then we click on the slide again, and the definition will come up. Individuals, institutions, the environment, everything survives and thrives based on everything else around them. So if we've had an opportunity to cultivate a level of impartiality and that sense of common humanity, and we really worked on forgiveness and gratitude, when it comes to systems, we want to be able to promote what is best for everyone. And so then Michael is going to talk to us a little bit about our breakout groups and what that means.
Thank you, Jennifer. This breakout group can actually be relatively tricky if it doesn't get started in the right way. We provide a lot of details in the guide, the facilitator guide, to help you through it, but starting it in the right way is really important. And what's key here is that oftentimes as people begin to look at systems, they look at it through the lens of what is the problem they're trying to address. And although that can be very beneficial and very useful, what it can also do is mean that they start with identifying an issue that they already think they have a solution to. And it can make the whole process of really trying to open their eyes to the entire system and all of the benefits and harms and all of the possible solutions and all of the causes and conditions. It can kind of warp that discussion. So in order to prevent that, the best way to start this is by having just a general conversation before you break people into groups. Have a general conversation of what is it that we mean by a system? What are some examples of a system? What are some characteristics of a system? And we give you guidance through the facilitator guide on how to lead this conversation. But you want them to give their own examples, and you want them to be able to see what are kind of some of those general characteristics, such as the fact that systems are dynamic, that they are at least originally set up to achieve some sort of common good, that they're based on rules and inputs and outputs, and that they interact with other systems, right? So focusing on this idea of interdependence. The other thing you want to do here is, as you get examples of systems, you want to write those up on a whiteboard or on a pad of paper that everyone can see, because you want that to be the basis of the breakout groups. So if people give you examples of systems such as judicial system, education system, economic systems, things like that, what you'll do is you'll identify what those are, and then you'll ask people in the audience or in the group what they might be interested in looking at, which kinds of systems. And based on the number of breakout groups you're going to have, you want to identify that same number of systems. So if you're going to break people up into 3 groups, identify 3 of those systems that they might want to work on, and then split the group up based on which system they want to work on. So if you have one person who's looking at judicial system, that's great, or criminal justice system, that's one group. Economic system can be another group. Environmental systems could be another group, just depending on what they're interested in working on, and see if you can get people to split themselves up relatively equally. But a key component is making sure people are involved in a system that they're both interested in and maybe have some knowledge about. The next step in that process to help make this the most effective is to have them try to then narrow down the system that they're looking at. So if they're looking at a criminal justice system, maybe narrow it down to a particular location or a particular site of that system. So if it's criminal justice, it might be looking at it in a particular prison, or it might be looking at the juvenile justice system in the state of Georgia, for example. And similarly with whether it's a religious system or an economic system, narrowing the scope down a little bit will help in the exercise that follows. So those 2 kind of basic guidelines will help make this a really robust and effective kind of breakout group for this session and the next session that we do. Again, systems that they are focused on that are general, not focusing on a problem first or a solution first, but a general system, having people move into groups based on those systems, and then having them identify a specific instantiation or a specific example of that system that they want to work on. And then that will lead you into this breakout group, which is really all about mapping that system. And the goal, hopefully, of this is for them to be able to see all of the various connections and causes and conditions and components, the real interdependence of this system that is so critical for really understanding whatever problem they might ultimately want to deal with. So when you have finished that part of this breakout group, you want to bring people back together and do some, after people have had a chance to present the systems that they each worked on and an opportunity for some questions and answers and debriefing, what you want to do is click to the next slide, which is talking a little bit about why is this system's perspective important. Now, we talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the session, where we talked about why discernment is necessary, but now that they've had an opportunity, what we want to really say is, what have you learned from this process? have you learned anything? Is a systems perspective important? Has this changed the way that you see your particular system in any way? And some of that will be helpful by just reading through the guide and looking at how to present this. But some of the things we want to pull out here are, again, if you click to the next slide, we just get an example of some of the different components of a system that may emerge. But some of the points we want to get across through the conversation are a systems perspective helps us understand the causes of issues, except not the symptoms. Far too often we focus in on symptoms and not causes, and by addressing those symptoms, we actually don't address the underlying causes, which means that the solutions will be very short-lived or not effective at all. The next is that just recognizing that everything arises out of a series of causes and conditions, and that you have to understand all of those causes and conditions as best as possible in order to start to figure out what the causes of the problem are and where potential solutions might lie. And also understanding the system itself can understand how there could be unintended consequences to some of our solutions. So by seeing the entire map, we recognize that affecting a component over here may have an unintended consequence on a component over here or people over here. And so if we don't see the whole system and we're just focusing on the symptom and we're just focusing on one piece of the system, then we're going to make a change that could potentially affect other people in a negative way. And then finally is to recognize that these systems are actually a reflection of the whole culture, the whole society, and we are part of that. And so if we want to try to make a positive impact on that, one of the things that we should be thinking about is how we personally engage in the system, but also how our values and the values of those around us get represented through the system, and how focusing on those values and shifting those values can be very important in terms of shifting the whole system. And so if you click again, I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
Thank you, Michael. So we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail in a few moments the positive peace report, but this is this is the definition. And when Michael clicked through, you probably saw some of the animation graphics for it. But this is the definition that they are using for systems: self-regulating, self-modifying. And each system is encased within or encases other systems. So everything is connected. And understanding that interdependence is essential in order for us to be able to thrive as a society. It's our global challenge. It's what we need to be able to do and understand in order to be able to move forward. So then when we click to the next slide, we have a great audio clip from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we can play that for the group, which really provides a solid understanding of that interdependence in one person's day from start to finish. It's a great audio clip. And then we click to our next slide, which is part 2 of our breakout groups. So we're going to continue exploring our systems that we started to talk about in our first breakout group. And on this one, we're going to be talking about the kinds of harms and benefits that come from the systems that we were talking about. So if we had those concrete examples that Michael was talking about, the juvenile justice system in the state of Georgia. So if that's what we're talking about, then we're going to focus on, for this part of our breakout group, we're going back into the same groups, that we are looking at and identifying the kinds of harms and benefits that come from those systems and what those harms and benefits can actually do and or look like with the groups. So after we've had an opportunity to do that with the group, we're going to come back to the large group and we're going to go into the next slide. And so when we were talking about the harms and the benefits, it's helpful to understand how these harms and benefits can impact a system. And so, what we're going to look at is the first part of how the harms and the benefits impact a system, and that would be through direct violence. And if you'll notice the visual, direct violence is literally just the tip of the iceberg. And so we talk about direct violence and what that looks like and what that is, and of course provide an opportunity for the group to talk about direct violence and give the definition. And then we are going to click again, we pull up the definition of direct violence in CIT from the Institute of Economics and Peace. And then Michael is going to move us to the next two forms of violence, which go a little bit deeper into the iceberg.
Thank you, Jen. So after you've got this definition pulled up, when you click again, the definition fades out, and the word direct violence shows it pointing to just the tip of the iceberg. And so this kind of emphasizes that idea that this is just the tip of the iceberg and that there's much more going on in culture and in society that causes these harms. And if you click again, the word direct violence will get replaced by structural violence. And so here's an opportunity to begin talking about what comes under the surface. And again, as Jennifer mentioned, you will open it up for a conversation and have a discussion about what we mean by structural violence, what people think structural violence is. And if you click again, you'll see a definition itself will emerge the way that we use it. One of the things also you can mention here is that these ideas of direct, structural, and what will be next, cultural violence, all come out of the conflict transformation and peace studies world. And so we're kind of appreciative of that research and that scholarship to help us understand these different layers of violence or harm that can happen in society. And here with structural violence, we just want to really emphasize the fact that these are social structures that are in place that can cause harm to individuals in a way that affects one group of people more than another group of people. One obvious example of this would be slavery and the institution of slavery, and then all of the legal, economic, and even religious apparatus that were built up in society around that were set up in an institutional way that perpetuated and authorized the institution of slavery, which also caused direct violence. So the structural violence really did its own damage, but that damage was on a structural level, but it also authorized in a way the direct violence that occurred specifically to individuals. So when you click the next time, that definition will fade out, and we have the same idea here with structural violence pointing to kind of the middle part of the iceberg. And when you click the next time, structural violence goes away, and we have what's called cultural violence will appear. And again, you'll ask them what we mean by this and if they have any ideas. And you click again, and the definition comes up here. And these are the beliefs, practices, artwork, ideologies, all of the things that permeate culture that can authorize both the structural violence and the direct violence. So if we can think of like images that we see on a regular basis of one particular cultural or ethnic group and how they're stereotyped or how they're portrayed, that ultimately begins to seep into our psyche in a way that can potentially authorize and justify why we might have structural systems set up that oppress or discriminate against one particular group, which then again can also authorize why we might cause direct violence to one particular group of people over another. So all three of these, the direct violence, the structural violence, and the cultural violence, work together to kind of perpetuate issues in society. And if you click again, we have all three layers there showing how they work together in this metaphor of an iceberg. And one good question might be here is to have the group think about how the harms that they saw in their system, how they might be divided into these three groups between direct, structural, and cultural violence. And then after they've had a chance to maybe talk about that as a large group, to then think about which layer is the most effective to change. Like, which layer do we want to attack in order to shift the way that the harm is being done? And obviously, direct violence is something that is horrific and needs to be addressed right away. But when we go back to that idea of dealing with symptoms rather than causes, one of the things that we might find in this discussion is the fact that direct violence is, again, just the tip of the iceberg, and just addressing the direct violence that doesn't change the structural or the cultural violence is something that may not be very long lasting and may not actually change the problem at its core. And so this helps people look at their systems map in a maybe a little bit more nuanced way, so that they can begin to see where they might be able to have the greater impact on the issue that they're trying to address. One other thing to point out at this point is also the fact that hopefully if the group has been able to look at their systems in a more objective way, just mapping out the system, trying to identify the harms and benefits that come from the system, recognizing that the system does create many benefits for many people, even at the same time as it's causing harm for some people. This not only helps them address how they're going to make the system better, but it also helps them identify what the real issues are. If you remember in the beginning, I said we don't want them to go into this exercise having identified a problem and a potential solution already. What we want them to be able to see is the problem emerge from the map, from the drawing, from the conversation, and it will enable them to be hopefully more objective about what the problems are, and maybe even more effective about creating solutions to those problems. And so that's another thing to point out here by dividing this map up and seeing all of the harms and all of the benefits. It maybe gives us a broader view and a more nuanced view of what the problems are and ultimately what solutions we might want to create. On the flip side, we also want to recognize that there can also be direct structural and cultural peace. And here we talk about the idea that what we're shooting for is not just negative peace. Negative peace, again, a term that comes out of peace studies and conflict transformation. Negative peace is simply the absence of violence. And as we all know, the absence of violence doesn't necessarily promote peace. It's not a system that is absent of structural or cultural violence. It's purely lacking in direct violence. What we want is a cultural peace or a structural peace, a cultural peace that promotes well-being and flourishing for the most number of people. And here again, if you click to the next slide, you have a bit of another graphic coming out of the Institute for Economics and Peace. And by the way, the Institute of Economics and Peace is the largest think tank in the world that is devoted to looking at issues of peace and the economic benefits that come from peaceful societies. And here we're talking about the idea of a positive peace. Again, this is just one model. We're not suggesting that this is the only model to think about, but in having a general conversation with your group and having imagined what a positive peace might look like, a positive cultural and structural peace might look like, this is one model where you have, and I won't read through each of the bubbles, but you can have that conversation with people where this is what they're saying is the components of a sustainable society that is flourishing and promoting peace at every level. If you click one more time, a quote from that report comes up, and it's so a positive peace is defined here as the presence, not just the absence of violence, but the presence of behaviors, attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. So an opportunity to imagine what that might look like with your group. When you click to the next slide, we move into our reflective writing and mindful dialogues.
Great. Thank you. So this is how we're going to end our session for today. So we've appreciated interdependence throughout the whole session. And now we're going to have a chance to write about it and reflect on it and have some conversation with some of our colleagues about what that looks like. So then we click to the last slide for the day, And that wraps up our presentation for the day. We've just finished skill number 9, appreciating interdependence. And next session, or the next video, will be all about engaging with discernment.